Hello class, my name is Cassia Salas, and today I will be telling you about the suicides at Foxconn. This Thinking Critical story is located on page 202 and 203 in chapter 9. I chose this story because it caught my attention right off the bat, and it sounded like something that could be potentially turned into a suspenseful film and that I would most definitely watch. It was also kind of triggered a couple of things from the Belko Experiment, which is a movie that I just watched, and but there's a couple of similarities from both those stories. I have always wondered about suicide, and it has always caught my attention and arose a lot of different questions when it occurs or when the subject has been brought up. Within this critical thinking case, the employees at Foxconn faced dangerously fast assembly lines, military-style drills, verbal abuse by superiors, and they are pressured to work 13 consecutive days to complete orders, and it's not an option. In 2010, 32 people tried to commit suicide. 12 succeeded, and the other 20 failed, but they were seriously injured after trying to attempt this. These suicides drew a lot of the media's attention, and also the employment practices of Foxconn immediately bringing up many questions as to why, and causing many to dig into the employees' working conditions and digging deeper into the problem. New hires are paid a minimum wage of 900 yens or $130 a month. However, workers routinely are required to put in overtime, typically 3 times the legal limit of overtime. Foxconn employees' wages are higher compared to other jobs in China, but are not near enough to cover their rent, nor leave money left over for their families, and definitely not enough based on how much they're working and putting into the job. These working conditions are far from ideal and are too stressful for any one person to work in. My first question is, will Foxconn's response be sufficient to stop any future suicide attempts? Why or why not? Foxconn's response to the suicide attempts was to surround the building with nets, hire counselors for employees experiencing a lot of stress from the working conditions, and assign workers into groups of 50 people so everybody can kind of keep an eye on each other for emotional stress. This response is merely a short-term prevention goal. It does not stop the suicides, nor does it address the real root of the problem. For example, whenever they're going to surround the building with nets to prevent suicides from happening, someone is going to think of a different way to make this happen. Instead of just jumping off the building. Foxconn's organizational culture resembles a herd mentality, and in a herd mentality environment, employees are influenced by other employees to embrace similar behaviors, such as speaking, thinking, or acting alike, which in turn decentralizes individual decision making. Foxconn says it is at wit's end and as to how to tackle the problem, and has even had a Buddhist monk try to come in to rid the company of evil spirits. We suggest that Foxconn should plan to give more human rights to their employees by improving the working conditions, paying a good living wage similar to what is paid in the United States. Employees are businesses or companies' biggest resource and asset. Without your loyal employees, there would be no business. If Foxconn refuses to address the issues at hand and start treating employees like they are humans and not a machine, suicide attempts will not stop. Their response is a start. They just need to keep up with it and don't stop at the bare minimum. My second question, would you describe Foxconn's response as an example of proactive or reactive ethics, and why? Foxconn's response was definitely reactive to the suicides, because reactive ethical policies is a policy that results when organizations are driven by events and or a fear of future events. Whereas the definition of proactive ethical policies is a policy that results when the company develops a clear sense of what it stands for as an ethical organization. It is clear that Foxconn did not practice proactive ethics because they waited until a serious situation occurred, like this suicides and then the media criticism and all these people coming in. Foxconn would have probably never improved their business without this dramatic cry out for help from their workers. But even with this cry from their employees, Foxconn didn't improve their ethical standards and policies until the media exposed them and their poor treatment to their workers. It is unfortunate that many companies wait until they have been exposed or a problem has arose up in order to create a better policy, because normally when you wait, it's too late because something like suicides has already occurred. If the company would have been proactive, they wouldn't have allowed so many suicide attempts in the past, where more than 12 employees found the working conditions so oppressive that they elected to kill themselves. So there was no proactive ethics here. My third question, if China's young workers are sending a clear signal that they do not want to work in sweatshop factories, what can executives do from an ethics perspective to win them back? In the China sweatshops, they're huge because this is where majority of the world's manufactured goods are produced. The conditions of the sweatshops have always been tough, but after a number of suicides at Foxconn, it became extremely well known how bad it really was for the company. After the young workers in China clearly stated that they did not want to work at these factories, it would be very hard to win them back, especially going to the extent that they were going to show that they didn't want to be there. First of all, conditions where these people live are horrible. No one should have to live like this. It is dirty everywhere. There are many people who live in one room. The money issue became so important that these workers who came to the factory for money are under the conditions that are worse than in prison. The living areas are not the only places that are considered bad, but also the working area. These young people have to work many hours straight, sitting in the same spot and doing the same work all day long on the same details for an iPhone. They also have to work extra hours where they are not paid legally correct for their overtime. The salaries and wages are bare minimum, so the hours they have spent doing their job, harming their health, cannot even cover or justify how much work they are putting forth. Production facilities fail to meet even the minimum health and safety standards, which prove that there is a lot of harm to the people working there. Some people have committed suicide just because they could not deal with the hard working and living conditions that they were put in. So after this terrible event that happened at Foxconn, there are not very many people who would still want to get into the work of a factory. To have this big number of workers back, the executives would have to give employees way better conditions. Businesses should uphold the elimination and discrimination in employment and occupation, which means that they should clean the living area, serve better food, not just take the cheapest and easiest route to get out of things. The working hours should be a set time, like having a set shift for each employee, and once that time limit is hit, employees should have the right to say yes or no whether they'd want to work overtime or not. The wages of the extra hours should be higher because legally for overtime you do have to pay your employees more. However, since sweatshops in China produce millions of goods such as iPhones in a very short period of time, there's typically no other way to get this work done or reach the goal without overtime. This is a very effective way to produce lots of product very quickly. This also becomes a cheap way of working because a factory does not provide any quality food or living. So although it is effective and cheap, it does not justify the harm and stress that it puts on employees. Foxconn should definitely apologize in front of the families of those whose relatives committed suicide, because the very tough working conditions and stress of working there is why they committed suicide. This is an extremely sad case, and no one person should ever feel like they have to take their life, especially because of a working condition. This has to come to an immediate halt. Never did I think I'd read of something like the working conditions are so bad that someone would have to kill themselves. As businesses, we have to work hard to better our environment so our employees feel comfortable. Companies wouldn't exist if it weren't for the employees, so we need to make them feel like they matter and that they're people too. Thank you.